Sarah
Keep it
Martinez had
steady.
been working at the
Control the
Coronado
recoil on
Naval
this
Special
one.
Warfare Training Center for 3 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Every morning at 0600 hours, she would unlock the equipment shed, load her maintenance cart with fresh practice targets, and begin her rounds through the various training facilities. It was methodical work that required precision, attention to detail, and the ability to stay invisible while some of the world's most dangerous men honed their deadly skills. The desert sun was already climbing toward its brutal peak as Sarah pushed her cart along the concrete path toward Range Charlie. Her khaki work uniform was practical but unremarkable, designed to blend into the background of military efficiency. Most people at the facility knew her only as the target girl, the civilian contractor who kept the training ranges supplied with fresh silhouettes and steel targets. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was safety in a world where men trained to kill with their bare hands. Sarah had never intended to work in military training. 3 years ago, she had been a recent college graduate with a degree in logistics and a mountain of student debt. The job posting had been simple: maintenance technician needed for federal training facility. Security clearance required. Competitive pay. She had applied thinking it would be temporary, just long enough to get her financial feet under her and figure out what she really wanted to do with her life. What she hadn't expected was how much she would grow to respect the work happening around her. These weren't the swagger-filled action heroes she had seen in movies. The men who trained here were quiet professionals who treated their weapons and their mission with a reverence that bordered on religious. They were precise, disciplined, and utterly focused on preparing for missions that most Americans would never hear about. Sarah's own father had been military Army infantry who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before retiring as a master sergeant. Growing up, she had absorbed his lessons about attention to detail, personal responsibility, and the importance of every job in supporting the mission. Every person on base matters, he had told her countless times. From the commanding officer to the person who cleans the latrines. Mission success depends on everyone doing their job right. That philosophy had served her well in this position. While the SEALs and other special operations personnel focused on their training, Sarah focused on ensuring their equipment was always ready. She knew which instructors preferred their targets at exactly which distances. She understood how wind patterns affected paper targets and adjusted accordingly. She had memorized the training schedules and could predict when fresh targets would be needed before the request was even made. Range Charlie was one of the more complex facilities, a multi-level training area that simulated urban combat environments. Today's schedule showed advanced marksmanship training for a group of SEAL candidates who were in their final phase of qualification. Sarah had worked with this group before. They were serious young men who treated every exercise as if lives depended on it, because soon enough, lives would. As she approached the range, she could hear the familiar sounds of preparation, gear being checked, safety protocols being reviewed, the quiet conversation of men who had learned to communicate efficiently and precisely. Sarah parked her cart at the designated equipment area and began unloading the fresh practice figures she had prepared that morning. The practice figures weren't simple paper targets. These were sophisticated training aids designed to simulate real combat scenarios. Some were cardboard silhouettes that could be programmed to move on tracks. Others were more advanced weighted figures that could be positioned in doorways and windows to create realistic shooting scenarios. Each one was carefully maintained and positioned according to specific training requirements that Sarah had learned to interpret from the instruction sheets left by the range officers. She was focused on replacing a damaged torso target when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. This wasn't unusual. Instructors often checked on her work to ensure everything was positioned correctly. She continued working, expecting to hear the familiar voice of Lieutenant Commander Roberts or one of the other range officers she had worked with regularly. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was unfamiliar, younger than most of the instructors, with a slight southern accent that carried the clipped precision of military training. Sarah straightened and turned around, wiping her hands on the small towel she kept attached to her belt. The man standing before her was clearly a SEAL candidate. He had the lean, muscular build that came from months of intense physical training, and his uniform bore the telltale signs of someone still earning his place in the special operations community. His name tape read Thompson, and his eyes held the intense focus that Sarah had learned to recognize in men who were constantly being tested. What surprised her was that he was alone. SEAL candidates rarely operated individually during training exercises, especially on the ranges where safety protocols required multiple personnel for any live fire activities. She glanced around, looking for his teammates or an instructor, but saw no one else in the immediate area.
can I help you with something?
Sarah asked, maintaining the professional tone she had learned to use with all military personnel on the base. Thompson shifted slightly, and Sarah noticed that his right hand was resting on his holstered sidearm. This wasn't unusual, all personnel on the ranges were armed, but something about his posture suggested tension rather than the relaxed readiness she was accustomed to seeing. "I need you to step away from the equipment," Thompson said quietly. His voice was steady, but Sarah caught something underneath it that made her pause. This wasn't the tone of someone making a routine request. Sarah's mind immediately went to safety protocols. Perhaps there was a malfunction with one of the targets, or maybe there was some kind of emergency she wasn't aware of. She had been trained to comply immediately with any safety-related instructions from military personnel. "Of course," she said, taking several steps back from her cart. "Is there a problem with one of the targets?" Thompson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer to her cart and began examining the equipment she had been working with. His movements were careful and deliberate, and Sarah noticed that his hand had moved from resting on his weapon to actually gripping the handle. It was then that she noticed something else that made her stomach tighten with the first real flutter of concern. Thompson's uniform, while clearly military and bearing the appropriate insignia, had subtle differences from what she was accustomed to seeing. The fabric was slightly different, and some of the patches were positioned in ways that didn't match the standard configuration she had learned to recognize after 3 years of working around Navy personnel. Sarah had been raised by a military father who had taught her to observe details that most civilians missed. Situational awareness, he called it. Always know what's normal, so you'll recognize when something isn't. Right now, everything about this situation felt not normal. The range around them was quieter than it should be. Normally, training exercises involved multiple personnel, constant communication, and the controlled chaos of men pushing themselves to their limits. Today, there was an unusual stillness that Sarah hadn't noticed until this moment. Thompson finished his examination of her equipment and straightened up, his hand still on his weapon. When he looked at her, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her realize this wasn't a training exercise gone wrong or a safety concern. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain calm," Thompson said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable edge of someone making a threat rather than a request. "We're going to walk over to the equipment shed, and you're going to open it for me." The equipment shed contained more than just training targets. It held ammunition, specialized weapons used for training exercises, and various pieces of equipment that Sarah didn't fully understand but knew were important enough to require her security clearance to access. More importantly, it contained communication equipment that could connect directly to base security and command personnel. Sarah's training kicked in, not military training, but the crisis management protocols that all civilian contractors were required to learn. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Look for opportunities to get help or remove yourself from danger. Above all, don't do anything that might escalate the situation. "I can do that," Sarah said carefully, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline that was now coursing through her system. "May I ask why you need access to the shed?" Thompson's response was to draw his sidearm, not pointing it directly at her but making it clear that it was ready for immediate use. "Just walk, ma'am. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." As they began walking toward the equipment shed, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Thompson was clearly military trained, but his behavior suggested he wasn't here as part of any official exercise. The subtle inconsistencies in his uniform, the fact that he was operating alone, and, most importantly, the way he was treating her as a potential threat rather than a civilian employee all pointed towards something that had nothing to do with SEAL training. The equipment shed was located about 50 meters from Range Charlie, positioned to provide easy access to multiple training areas while remaining secure from unauthorized personnel. Sarah had the keycard access that would open the electronic locks, and she had the override codes for the manual backup systems. More importantly, she knew that opening the shed would trigger automatic security notifications unless specific protocols were followed. As they walked, Sarah became aware of another sound that had been absent from her normal routine, the distant sound of rotary aircraft. Looking up, she could see helicopters in the distance, but they were flying in patterns that didn't match the usual training operations she was familiar with. These aircraft seemed to be conducting some kind of search pattern, moving back and forth across the base in a grid that suggested they were looking for something specific. Or someone specific. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thompson wasn't a SEAL candidate conducting a training exercise. He was someone who didn't belong here, someone who had managed to infiltrate one of the most secure military facilities in the United States, and someone who needed access to weapons or communication equipment for reasons that definitely weren't authorized. Sarah's father had taught her that in crisis situations, the most important thing was to buy time. Help is always coming, he had said. Your job is to stay alive until it arrives. Looking at the helicopters in the distance and thinking about the unusual quiet on the range, Sarah began to suspect that help was indeed coming, but that it might not arrive before Thompson got what he was looking for. As they reached the equipment shed, Thompson positioned himself so that he could see both Sarah and the approaches to the building. His weapon was now clearly visible, held in a ready position that demonstrated professional training in its use. "Open it," he said simply. Sarah reached for her keycard, her hand trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. As she prepared to swipe the card through the reader, she made a decision that would change everything about the next few minutes. Instead of immediately opening the shed, she paused and looked directly at Thompson. "Before I do this," she said quietly, "I need you to know that opening this door is going to trigger automatic security alerts. Whatever you're planning, you're going to have about 3 minutes before this place is surrounded." Thompson's eyes narrowed, and, for a moment, Sarah thought she had made a terrible mistake. But, then, she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested her words had hit their mark. "Just open the door," he said, but his voice now carried less certainty than it had before. Sarah swiped her keycard and entered her access code, knowing that somewhere in the base security center, alerts were already flashing on computer screens and security personnel were beginning to move. She had bought time, but now she needed to figure out how to use it. The equipment shed's electronic locks disengaged with a soft beep, and Sarah stepped back as Thompson moved toward the now open doorway. The interior of the shed was organized with military precision, weapons secured in locked racks, ammunition stored in clearly labeled containers, and communication equipment positioned on sturdy metal shelving. Everything Thompson needed to cause serious damage or gather critical intelligence was within his reach. Sarah watched as Thompson's eyes quickly scanned the interior, clearly looking for something specific. His movements were efficient and purposeful, confirming her growing suspicion that this wasn't a random infiltration but a targeted operation with specific objectives. Whatever Thompson was after, he knew exactly where to find it. "Step inside," Thompson ordered, gesturing toward the shed with his weapon. "Move to the back wall and keep your hands visible." Sarah complied, moving past the weapons racks toward the rear of the shed. Her mind was racing through possibilities for escape or resistance, but Thompson's professional demeanor and obvious training made it clear that any sudden movements would likely end badly for her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, "When you're outgunned and outmatched, use your brain instead of your body." Thompson moved quickly to a specific section of communication equipment, handling the devices with the familiarity of someone who had been trained on their operation. He began connecting cables and powering up systems, all while keeping his weapon easily accessible and maintaining visual contact with Sarah. "What are you trying to accomplish here?" Sarah asked quietly, hoping to keep him talking while the security response that she hoped was coming continued to develop. Thompson didn't answer immediately, focused on entering commands into a communication terminal that Sarah recognized as one of the secure systems used for coordinating special operations missions. After several seconds, he looked up at her with an expression that carried equal parts determination and regret. "I'm trying to prevent something terrible from happening," he said simply. "And, unfortunately, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Before Sarah could respond, both she and Thompson heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Multiple engines, moving fast, with the distinctive rumble of military transport vehicles. Thompson's head snapped toward the shed entrance, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. "They're moving faster than I expected," Thompson muttered, his fingers flying over the communication terminal's keyboard. "I need more time." Sarah realized that whatever Thompson was trying to accomplish with the communication equipment, he wasn't finished. The approaching vehicles represented either rescue for her or a significant complication for his plans, but either way, the situation was about to become more volatile. The sound of vehicles stopped, replaced by the coordinated movement of multiple personnel deploying around the equipment shed. Sarah could hear the quiet communication of professional soldiers taking positions, the soft sounds of equipment being checked, and the deliberate footsteps of people who were preparing for a confrontation. Thompson abandoned the communication terminal and moved to a position near the shed entrance where he could see outside while maintaining control over Sarah. His weapon was now raised and ready, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he prepared for whatever was about to happen. "Listen carefully," Thompson said to Sarah, his voice now carrying the urgency of someone whose carefully planned operation was falling apart. "When they make contact, I'm going to need you to tell them that you're safe and that I'm not a threat to you. Can you do that?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're holding me at gunpoint in a secure military facility. How exactly are you not a threat to me?" "Because I'm not going to hurt you," Thompson replied. "But if they think I am, this situation is going to get very bad very quickly." Before Sarah could respond, a voice called out from outside the shed. It was amplified by some kind of megaphone or communication system, and it carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Individual in the equipment shed, this is Lieutenant Commander Roberts of Naval Special Warfare Group 1. You are surrounded by armed personnel, and this facility is under lockdown. Come out with your hands visible, and release the civilian contractor immediately." Sarah felt a surge of relief at hearing Lieutenant Commander Roberts' voice. She had worked with him dozens of times over the past 3 years, and she knew him to be a competent and level-headed officer who would handle this situation professionally. More importantly, his presence meant that this wasn't just base security responding to her access alert, this was a coordinated special operations response. Thompson's expression darkened as he heard the announcement. "Lieutenant Commander Roberts," he repeated quietly. "I know that name." There was something in Thompson's voice that made Sarah pay closer attention. It wasn't fear or surprise, but recognition coupled with what sounded almost like disappointment. "You know him?" Sarah asked. "We've worked together," Thompson replied curtly. "Which makes this more complicated." The megaphone crackled to life again. "Thompson, I know you can hear me. Whatever you think you're accomplishing in there, it's not worth throwing away your career and potentially hurting an innocent civilian. Come out now, and we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." Sarah's eyes widened as she realized the implications of what she had just heard. Lieutenant Commander Roberts knew Thompson by name, which meant Thompson really was military personnel, not an external infiltrator. This was some kind of internal situation involving U.S. military personnel, which made it potentially much more dangerous than a simple security breach. Thompson was quiet for several seconds, clearly weighing his options. When he finally spoke, it was to call out toward the shed entrance, his voice loud enough to be heard by the personnel outside. "Commander Roberts, I need 5 more minutes to complete my task. The civilian contractor is safe, but I can't come out yet." "That's not how this works, Thompson," Roberts replied immediately. "You come out now, or we come in after you. You know the protocols as well as I do." Sarah could see Thompson's jaw clench as he considered his rapidly diminishing options. Whatever he had been trying to accomplish with the communication equipment, he clearly hadn't finished, and the security response had arrived faster than he had anticipated. "Thompson," Sarah said quietly, "what task are you trying to complete? Maybe there's another way to accomplish it without this confrontation." Thompson looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to try to help resolve the situation rather than simply waiting for rescue. For the first time since their encounter had begun, Sarah saw uncertainty replace the determined focus in his eyes. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "This is about preventing something that could cost lives." "Try me," Sarah replied. "I've been working around special operations personnel for 3 years. I understand more about how these things work than you might think." Thompson was quiet for several seconds, and Sarah could see him struggling with a decision. Outside the shed, she could hear the quiet movement of personnel taking positions and the low murmur of tactical communications. Whatever was about to happen, it would happen soon. "There's a mission launching in 6 hours, Thompson finally said. "Intelligence that's going to get good people killed. I was trying to send updated information to prevent it." Sarah felt her understanding of the situation shift once again. If Thompson was telling the truth, this wasn't about stealing weapons or gathering intelligence for hostile purposes. This was about a soldier trying to prevent what he believed would be a disaster for his own people. "Have you tried going through normal channels?" Sarah asked. Thompson's laugh was bitter. "Normal channels are how we got into this mess. The people who planned this mission don't want to hear information that contradicts their assumptions." The megaphone crackled again, but this time the voice was different. more authoritative, with the kind of command presence that Sarah had learned to recognize in senior officers. "This is Captain Martinez, Facility Commanding Officer. Thompson, you have 30 seconds to come out with your hands visible, or we're coming in. This is not a negotiation." Sarah's breath caught as she heard the name. Captain Martinez. She had never met the facility commanding officer in person, but she had seen his name on dozens of official documents over the past 3 years. More importantly, Martinez was her father's surname, and she wondered if there was any connection to her family's military service. Thompson heard the announcement and straightened up with obvious resignation. 30 seconds, he muttered. That's not enough time to finish the transmission. Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. What if I helped you finish it? Thompson stared at her in shock. What? You said this is about preventing good people from getting killed, Sarah said quickly. If that's true, and if there's information that could save lives, then maybe we should focus on getting that information transmitted rather than on who's in trouble for breaking protocol. Sarah, I can't ask you to risk your job or your safety for this, Thompson said. It was the first time he had used her name, and Sarah realized he must have read it from her identification badge. More importantly, his use of her first name suggested that he was beginning to see her as a person rather than just an obstacle to his mission. You're not asking, Sarah replied. I'm offering. What do you need me to do? Thompson looked at her for several more seconds, clearly trying to determine whether she was sincere or whether this was some kind of attempt to manipulate the situation. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. The communication terminal needs to maintain connection for another 90 seconds to complete the data transfer, he said. If they come through that door before it's finished, people are going to die because of incomplete intelligence. Sarah nodded and moved toward the communication equipment. Show me what needs to be done. As Thompson began explaining the status indicators on the terminal, both of them heard new sounds from outside the shed. Different footsteps, moving with a stealth and precision that was noticeably different from the security personnel who had arrived earlier. These were the sounds of people who specialized in situations exactly like this one. SEALs, Thompson said quietly, recognizing the same sounds Sarah had noticed. They're not just going to wait for me to come out. Sarah looked at the communication terminal and saw that the progress indicator showed the transmission was only 60% complete. At the current rate, they needed at least another minute to finish whatever Thompson was trying to send. How important is this information? Sarah asked. Important enough that 8 men might die without it, Thompson replied grimly. Sarah thought about her father's lessons on military service and the importance of mission success. She thought about the men she had watched train on these ranges for the past 3 years, men who trusted their lives to the accuracy of intelligence and the competence of their support personnel. She thought about the fact that she was probably about to lose her job and possibly face criminal charges for what she was about to do. And then, she thought about 8 men whose lives might depend on the decision she made in the next few seconds. Then, we finished the transmission, Sarah said firmly. Thompson's eyes widened as he realized she was serious. Sarah, if you help me with this, you're going to be in as much trouble as I am. Maybe, Sarah replied. But if we don't finish it, and people die because of that, I'll be in trouble with myself for the rest of my life. Thompson nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. They were no longer a soldier and a civilian contractor caught in an awkward situation. They had become 2 people working together to accomplish something they both believed was more important than their own immediate safety. The sounds from outside were getting closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive preparations that indicated the SEAL team was about to make entry. Whatever they were going to do, they had to do it in the next few seconds. Thompson positioned himself near the shed entrance, his weapon ready but pointed away from Sarah and toward the door. Keep an eye on that progress indicator, he said. Tell me the moment it hits 100%. Sarah focused on the communication terminal, watching the percentage slowly climb while listening to the increasingly urgent sounds of tactical preparation from outside. 70%. 75%. The footsteps were right outside the door now. Thompson. Lieutenant Commander Roberts' voice called out one final time. This is your last chance. Come out now, or we're coming in. 80%. 85%. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of explosive charges being placed on the shed door. They were out of time. 90%, Sarah called out quietly. Thompson took a deep breath and made a decision that would define everything that happened next. Instead of waiting for the tactical team to breach the door, he reached for his weapon and began to remove it from its holster. But, instead of raising it in a threatening manner, he did something that surprised everyone, including Sarah. He reversed his grip on the weapon, holding it by the barrel, and prepared to offer it handle first to whoever came through the door. 95%, Sarah said. The door exploded inward. The explosive breach of the shed door happened with the controlled violence that Sarah had only seen in training videos. The heavy metal door buckled inward, smoke filled the interior space, and, within seconds, multiple figures in full tactical gear were flowing through the opening with weapons raised and ready. Sarah instinctively dropped to the floor near the communication terminal, her hands raised above her head while keeping her eyes on the progress indicator that now showed 98%. The transmission was so close to completion that she could practically feel the tension of those final seconds stretching like a wire about to snap. The lead figure through the door was clearly a Navy SEAL, moving with the fluid precision that Sarah had watched these men practice countless times on the training ranges. His weapon was trained on Thompson, but Sarah could see his eyes rapidly scanning the entire interior of the shed, assessing threats and gathering information with the speed of someone whose life had often depended on reading situations correctly in the first few seconds. Thompson, still holding his weapon by the barrel in a non-threatening position, slowly raised his other hand while keeping his eyes locked on the lead SEAL. The moment stretched out with the kind of crystalline clarity that Sarah had heard occurred during life-changing events, where every detail became magnified and time seemed to slow down. "Weapon down, now," the lead SEAL commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite being filtered through his tactical communications gear. "I'm complying," Thompson replied clearly, slowly placing his weapon on the floor and stepping back from it with his hands raised. The civilian contractor is unharmed and was not threatened. Sarah heard the communication terminal emit a soft beep that indicated the transmission had completed successfully. 100%. Whatever information Thompson had been trying to send had made it through, but she realized that announcing this fact right now might not be the wisest decision. The lead SEAL moved forward to secure Thompson's weapon while two additional team members maintained coverage and visual control of the entire shed. Sarah noticed that their movements were textbook perfect, no wasted motion, no unnecessary aggression, but absolutely no room for error or resistance. "Ma'am, are you injured?" one of the SEALs asked Sarah, his weapon lowered but ready as he approached her position near the communication equipment. "No, I'm not hurt," Sarah replied, keeping her hands visible as she slowly stood up. "He didn't threaten me or try to harm me in any way." The lead SEAL, whose name tape read Kowalski, looked at Thompson with an expression that combined professional assessment with what might have been personal recognition. "Thompson, what the hell are you doing here? Last I heard, you were assigned to Team 6 operations in Virginia." Thompson's response confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. This wasn't just a case of a random individual infiltrating the base, but something much more complex involving personnel who knew each other professionally. "I was trying to get information to the Kandahar team before they launched their mission tonight," Thompson said. "Information that command doesn't want to hear." Kowalski's posture shifted slightly at the mention of Kandahar, and Sarah could see recognition flash across his face even through his tactical gear. Whatever mission Thompson was referencing, it was something that Kowalski was familiar with. "That mission was scrubbed 2 hours ago," Kowalski said. Intelligence updates came through official channels. Thompson's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, relief, and then suspicion. What kind of intelligence updates? The kind that indicated the target location had been compromised and that friendly forces were operating in the area, Kowalski replied. The kind that would have gotten our people killed if they had proceeded with the original plan. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding. Thompson had been trying to prevent a mission that he believed would be disastrous, but that mission had already been called off through official channels. The information he had been so desperate to transmit had apparently already reached the right people through proper military communication systems. If the mission was scrubbed, Sarah asked quietly, then why was Thompson so convinced it was still happening? Kowalski looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten that a civilian contractor might be capable of asking relevant questions about military operations. After a moment's consideration, he seemed to decide that she had earned the right to understand what she had been caught up in. Because Thompson has been out of official communication for the past 18 hours, Kowalski explained. He was supposed to be on a transport back to Virginia, but he never checked in when he arrived. We've been looking for him since yesterday afternoon. Thompson's expression shifted to confusion and, then, to a growing realization that something had gone seriously wrong with his understanding of the situation. I received information 12 hours ago that the Kandahar mission was proceeding as planned despite the intelligence I had provided through my chain of command.
Who gave you that information? Kowalski asked, his tone becoming more intense.
Lieutenant Morrison, from the Intelligence Coordination Office, Thompson replied. He said my reports had been reviewed and dismissed, and that the mission would launch at 2,200 hours tonight. Kowalski and the other SEALs exchanged glances that told Sarah everything she needed to know about the significance of that name. Whatever Lieutenant Morrison had told Thompson, it had been incorrect or deliberately misleading. Thompson, Kowalski said carefully, Lieutenant Morrison has been under investigation by military intelligence for the past month.
He's been feeding false information to personnel who were in a position to interfere with ongoing operations.
The implications of this statement hit everyone in the shed simultaneously. Thompson had been manipulated into believing that his legitimate concerns were being ignored, which had led him to take desperate action to try to save his fellow soldiers. But, the desperate action had been unnecessary because the proper channels had actually worked, and the mission had been called off through official processes. More importantly, Thompson had been set up. Someone had wanted him to take exactly the kind of unauthorized action that would discredit him and remove him from any position where he could influence future operations. Sarah looked around at the faces of the men in the shed and realized that what had started as a simple hostage situation had just become something much more significant. Thompson wasn't a rogue operator acting on his own, he was a soldier who had been deliberately manipulated into compromising himself. Sir, one of the other SEALs said quietly to Kowalski, if Morrison was feeding Thompson false information to get him to take unauthorized action, then this whole incident might be part of something larger.
Kowalski nodded grimly.
Which means we need to find out who Morrison was working with and why they wanted Thompson neutralized. Thompson, who had been processing this information with visible shock, suddenly straightened up as another realization hit him.
The communication terminal, he said urgently. I completed the data transmission before you arrived.
If Morrison was working against us, then whoever he's working with now knows that I discovered their operation. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the implications. The transmission that she had helped Thompson complete might have just informed hostile parties that their manipulation had been discovered and that Thompson was now in custody where he could provide information about their operation.
What exactly did you transmit? Kowalski asked Thompson.
Everything I knew about Morrison's false communications, the real intelligence about the Kandahar situation, and my suspicions about why my reports were being suppressed, Thompson replied. I sent it to every senior officer I could think of who might be in a position to take action.
Kowalski was quiet for several seconds, clearly thinking through the ramifications of this information.
When he finally spoke, it was to address his team rather than Thompson. We need to get this information to command immediately, he said. If Thompson just exposed a counterintelligence operation by transmitting details about it to multiple recipients, then we're going to have people scrambling to cover their tracks. Sarah realized that her role in this situation was far from over. As the only civilian witness to everything that had happened, and as someone who had actively participated in completing the transmission, she was now a key part of whatever investigation would follow.
Kowalski, she said quietly, there's something else you should know.
The SEAL team leader turned his attention to her with the kind of focus that made Sarah understand why these men were so effective in high-pressure situations. I helped Thompson complete the transmission, Sarah continued. When it became clear that you were about to breach the door before the data transfer was finished, I made the decision to assist him rather than letting the transmission fail. The shed became very quiet as everyone processed this information. Sarah could see Kowalski calculating the implications of a civilian contractor actively participating in what had initially appeared to be a hostage situation but was now looking like a counterintelligence operation.
Why? Kowalski asked simply.
Sarah thought about her father's lessons, about the training she had watched these men undergo, about the seriousness with which they approached their mission of protecting the country. She thought about the 8 men whose lives Thompson had been trying to save, and about the importance of making sure that the truth reached people who could act on it. Because he convinced me that lives were at stake, Sarah replied. And, because after 3 years of working here, I've learned that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones you make when you don't have time to think about the consequences. Kowalski studied her face for several long seconds, and Sarah could see him evaluating her character and her motivations. Finally, he nodded with what might have been approval.
Ma'am, I think you're going to be spending some time talking with intelligence officers, he said. But, I also think you may have just helped prevent something much worse than what we initially thought we were dealing with. Thompson, who had been listening to this exchange, looked at Sarah with an expression of gratitude mixed with concern. Sarah, I'm sorry I got you involved in this. I never intended for a civilian to get caught up in military intelligence problems. You didn't get me involved, Sarah replied. I chose to get involved when I decided that helping you was more important than following protocol. Kowalski's radio crackled to life with an urgent communication from base command. As he listened to the transmission, Sarah could see his expression become increasingly serious. Roger that, Command, Kowalski replied into his radio. We're bringing both subjects in for immediate debriefing. He turned back to Thompson and Sarah with an expression that suggested their situation had just become much more complicated. Command just received Thompson's transmission, Kowalski informed them. They also received confirmation that Lieutenant Morrison disappeared from his post approximately 1 hour ago, taking several classified files with him. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that their actions in the shed had apparently triggered a much larger chain of events. Whatever Morrison had been planning, Thompson's transmission had forced him to accelerate his timeline and take more obvious action to protect himself. What does that mean for us? Thompson asked. Kowalski's answer was not reassuring. It means that you two just became the most important witnesses in a counterintelligence investigation that could involve enemy operatives with access to some of our most sensitive operations. As additional security personnel began arriving at the shed and the area was secured for investigation, Sarah realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't have imagined when she had gotten up that morning to replace practice targets. She was no longer just a civilian contractor who maintained training equipment, she was now a key participant in a national security investigation. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years was about to become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. But, as she looked at Thompson and thought about the men whose lives they might have saved, she realized that she wouldn't change the decision she had made, even knowing everything that was likely to follow. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of briefings, debriefings, and interviews that left Sarah feeling like she had tumbled down a rabbit hole into a world she had never imagined existed. The conference room in the base's administrative building where she found herself was sterile and windowless, designed for conversations that were never supposed to leave the room. Across the table from her sat Commander Patricia Williams from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, a woman whose sharp eyes and methodical questioning style suggested she had spent years getting to the truth of situations that other people preferred to keep buried. Next to her was Agent David Chen from what Sarah had been told was another government agency, a description that told her nothing while somehow managing to tell her everything she needed to know about the seriousness of her situation. Let's go through this one more time, Commander Williams said, consulting the extensive notes she had been taking throughout their conversation. You had been working at the facility for 3 years without any security incidents or unusual interactions with military personnel. That's correct, Sarah confirmed, wondering how many times she would need to repeat the same information before they were satisfied with her responses. And Thompson's behavior when he first approached you, you said it seemed unusual but not immediately threatening. Sarah nodded. He was alone, which was unusual for training exercises. His uniform had subtle differences from what I was used to seeing. And his manner was tense in a way that seemed different from normal training stress. Agent Chan leaned forward slightly. You mentioned that you noticed inconsistencies in his uniform. Can you be more specific about what caught your attention? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to recall the details that her father's training had taught her to observe. The fabric was slightly different, more like what Army personnel wear rather than Navy. Some of the patches were positioned incorrectly for a Navy SEAL candidate. And his boots were wrong for the terrain we were working on. Commander Williams made a note. Those are very specific observations for someone without military training. My father was Army infantry for 20 years, Sarah explained. He taught me to notice details that most civilians miss. He called it situational awareness. Agent Chen nodded with what might have been approval. Your father's training probably saved your life today. Those uniform inconsistencies were the first indication that Thompson wasn't where he was supposed to be. Sarah felt a chill at the implication that her life had been in more danger than she had realized. Was Thompson actually a threat to me? Not intentionally, Commander Williams replied carefully. But the situation he was in made him unpredictable, and unpredictable people in high-stress situations can become dangerous even when they don't mean to be.
Agent Chen opened a file folder and removed several photographs, placing them face down on the table.
Sarah, we need to show you some images and get your reactions.
Some of these may be disturbing, so please let us know if you need a break at any point.
Sarah nodded, steeling herself for whatever they were about to reveal. Agent Chen turned over the first photograph, which showed a man in military uniform that Sarah didn't recognize. Do you recognize this person?
Sarah studied the photograph carefully. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with the kind of lean build that suggested military training, but something about his posture seemed different from the military personnel she was accustomed to seeing.
I don't think I've seen him before, Sarah said.
But there's something about his stance that seems familiar.
This is Lieutenant Morrison, Commander Williams explained. The intelligence officer who gave Thompson the false information that led to today's incident.
Sarah looked at the photograph again, this time with the knowledge of who she was looking at. He looks military, but not quite right somehow. Agent Chen turned over the second photograph, which showed the same man in civilian clothes standing next to what appeared to be a foreign embassy building. Morrison has been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services for the past 8 months, he explained. Thompson's investigation into intelligence failures was getting too close to exposing Morrison's activities.
The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. So Morrison set Thompson up to discredit him and remove him from the investigation? That's exactly what happened, Commander Williams confirmed.
Morrison fed Thompson false information designed to make him take desperate action that would destroy his credibility and, potentially, his career. Agent Chen turned over the third photograph, and Sarah gasped at what she saw. It was a surveillance image showing Morrison meeting with 2 men who were clearly not American military personnel. The meeting appeared to be taking place in some kind of parking garage, with documents being exchanged between the parties. This photograph was taken 4 days ago, Agent Chen explained. Morrison was scheduled to provide his contacts with detailed information about upcoming special operations missions, including the Kandahar operation that Thompson was trying to protect. Sarah felt sick as she realized how close they had come to a disaster much worse than anything she had imagined.
If Thompson hadn't sent that transmission, would Morrison have been able to pass that information to enemy agents?
Probably, Commander Williams replied grimly. Your decision to help Thompson complete the transmission likely prevented classified operational details from reaching people who would have used them to target American soldiers. Agent Chen turned over the final photograph, which showed several men in what appeared to be tactical gear but with weapons and equipment that Sarah didn't recognize from her work at the training facility. These are the individuals that Morrison was working with, Agent Chen explained. Foreign intelligence operatives who specialize in targeting special operations personnel and missions. If they had received the information Morrison was planning to provide, multiple American lives would have been at risk. Sarah stared at the photographs, trying to process the magnitude of what she had unknowingly become involved in. When she had made the decision to help Thompson complete his transmission, she had thought she was helping to save 8 soldiers on a single mission. Now she was learning that her actions had helped expose an espionage operation that could have affected dozens of missions and hundreds of American lives.
What happens now? Sarah asked quietly.
Commander Williams and Agent Chen exchanged glances before Williams answered. Morrison and his contacts are now the subjects of an international investigation. Thompson has been cleared of all wrongdoing and will be returning to his unit with commendations for uncovering the security breach.
And what about me? Sarah asked. Agent Chen smiled for the first time during their interview. You're being recommended for a civilian commendation for your actions today. You're also being offered a position with significantly higher security clearance if you're interested in continuing to work in support of special operations. Sarah was quiet for several seconds, processing this unexpected turn of events. What kind of position? Intelligence analysis and operational support, Commander Williams explained. Your ability to notice details that others miss, combined with your demonstrated judgment under pressure, makes you exactly the kind of person we need in critical support roles. Sarah thought about her father's lessons about military service and the importance of every person doing their job to support the mission. She thought about the men she had watched train for 3 years, and about how their lives might depend on having competent people in support positions. She thought about Thompson's willingness to risk his career to save his fellow soldiers, and about the foreign operatives who were working to put American lives at risk. Would I still be working here at Coronado? Sarah asked. Initially, yes, Agent Chen replied.
But you would also have opportunities to work at other facilities and on different types of operations as your experience and clearance level increased. Sarah realized that the decision she was being offered represented a fundamental change in the direction of her life. She could return to her previous position, replacing practice targets and maintaining equipment, keeping her head down and staying invisible. Or she could step forward into a role where her observations and decisions might have real impact on national security operations.
Can I think about it? Sarah asked.
Of course, Commander Williams replied.
But we do need an answer within the next few days. The position we're discussing has some time-sensitive training requirements. Agent Chen gathered the photographs and returned them to his file folder. Sarah, there's one more thing you should know.
Thompson specifically requested that his commendation include recognition of your contribution to resolving this situation. He was very clear that your willingness to help him complete the transmission was crucial to exposing Morrison's operation. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride at this recognition, but also a sense of responsibility that was somewhat overwhelming.
Is Thompson going to be okay? I mean, after everything he went through with Morrison's manipulation?
Thompson is a resilient soldier with a strong support system in his unit, Commander Williams assured her. He'll be fine, and he'll be better equipped to handle similar situations in the future because of what he learned from this experience. As the interview concluded and Sarah prepared to leave the conference room, Agent Chen handed her a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "If you decide you're interested in the position we discussed, call that number," he said.
"If you decide you're not interested, call that number anyway.
After today, you're going to need someone you can talk to about security-related concerns, and that number will connect you with people who understand what you've been through." Sarah walked out of the administrative building into the late afternoon sun, feeling like she was emerging from an underground cavern into a world that looked the same but felt completely different. The training ranges where she had worked for 3 years were visible in the distance, with men continuing to practice the skills they might need to save lives and protect the country. But now Sarah understood that the support personnel who maintained those ranges, who kept the equipment functioning, and who paid attention to details that others might miss, were not just invisible background figures. They were integral parts of a complex system that protected American lives and national security interests. As she walked toward her car, Sarah thought about the offer she had received and the decision she would need to make. She thought about her father's lessons about military service and personal responsibility. She thought about Thompson's willingness to risk everything to protect his fellow soldiers. And she thought about the foreign operatives who had been working to exploit American military operations. By the time she reached her car, Sarah had already made her decision. She took out her cell phone and dialed the number on Agent Chen's card. "This is Sarah Martinez," she said when someone answered. "I'd like to accept the position we discussed today." The voice on the other end of the phone was professionally neutral but carried a note of approval.
"Welcome to the team, Ms. Martinez. Your training begins Monday morning."
As Sarah drove home that evening, she realized that her life had changed in ways that went far beyond a new job or higher security clearance. She had discovered that she was capable of making crucial decisions under pressure, that her observations and judgment could have real impact on important events, and that the invisible support roles she had always assumed were unimportant were actually critical to the success of missions that protected lives and national security. The woman who had gotten up that morning to replace practice targets was driving home as someone who had helped expose an international espionage operation. The transformation felt surreal, but also somehow inevitable, as if all of her father's lessons and all of her years of careful observation had been preparing her for exactly this moment. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the secure briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command, reviewing intelligence reports that would have been incomprehensible to her just a year ago. Her new position as senior intelligence analyst had exceeded every expectation she had held when Agent Chen first offered her the job, and she had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed. The briefing room was filled with some of the most experienced special operations personnel in the military, men and women whose opinions carried weight in decisions that affected national security. Today's meeting was focused on reviewing the lessons learned from what had become known throughout the special operations community as the Range Incident, the events that had led to the exposure of Lieutenant Morrison's espionage activities and the prevention of what could have been a catastrophic intelligence breach. Captain Martinez, the facility commanding officer whose voice Sarah had heard over the megaphone that day, stood at the front of the room presenting the final report on the investigation. Sarah had learned during her first week in her new position that Captain Martinez was indeed a distant cousin of her father's, and that her family's reputation for military service had been one of the factors that had accelerated her security clearance approval. The Morrison investigation concluded last week with guilty verdicts on all charges, Captain Martinez announced to the assembled personnel. 3 foreign intelligence operatives were arrested based on information provided during the debriefing process, and we have recovered classified materials that could have compromised at least 12 ongoing operations. Sarah listened to the summary of results that had grown out of that day in the equipment shed, still somewhat amazed at how much had changed because of a few crucial decisions made under pressure. Thompson had not only been cleared of all charges but had been promoted and was now working directly with counterintelligence personnel to improve security protocols for special operations units. The most significant aspect of this case, Captain Martinez continued, was the role played by civilian contractor Sarah Martinez, whose observations and decision-making under pressure were crucial to the successful resolution of the situation. Sarah felt the attention of the room focus on her, but, instead of the uncomfortable invisibility she had once preferred, she now felt the confidence that came from knowing her contributions were valued and recognized. The past 6 months had taught her that being noticed for the right reasons was far better than being invisible for the wrong ones. Lieutenant Commander Roberts, who had been the first to respond to the security alert that day, raised his hand to speak. "Ma'am, I'd like the record to reflect that Ms. Martinez's actions that day exemplified the kind of initiative and judgment that we should expect from all personnel in support positions. Her willingness to assist Thompson in completing his transmission, despite the obvious risks to her own safety and career, demonstrated exceptional dedication to mission success." Sarah nodded her appreciation for his support, remembering the fear and uncertainty she had felt when she first heard his voice over the megaphone. Now, after months of working closely with special operations personnel, she understood that his response that day had been precisely calibrated to resolve the situation with minimal risk to everyone involved. Kowalski, the SEAL team leader who had led the tactical response, spoke up from his position near the back of the room. "The tactical lessons from this incident have been incorporated into our training protocols for similar situations. But, the most important lesson is that sometimes the most critical intelligence comes from people who aren't supposed to be intelligence professionals." Captain Martinez nodded and moved to the next section of his presentation, which displayed a timeline showing how quickly the investigation had progressed once Thompson's transmission had alerted command personnel to the security breach. Morrison's espionage activities had been ongoing for 8 months before Thompson's investigation began to uncover inconsistencies, Captain Martinez explained. Without the transmission completed by Thompson and Ms. Martinez, Morrison would likely have succeeded in providing classified operational details to foreign intelligence services, potentially resulting in significant casualties among American personnel. Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this briefing room. Her new position had involved extensive training in intelligence analysis, counterintelligence protocols, and operational security. She had learned to read classified reports, identify patterns in intelligence data, and communicate findings to personnel who would act on her analysis. Most importantly, she had learned to trust her instincts and speak up when she noticed things that others might miss. The training had been intense and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been the most intellectually challenging and professionally satisfying work Sarah had ever done. Her civilian background had actually proven to be an asset, providing her with perspectives that complemented the military training of her colleagues without duplicating their existing capabilities. Agent Chen, who had been present for most of Sarah's training, stood up to address the room. "The interagency cooperation on this case has been exemplary, and Ms. Martinez's transition from civilian contractor to intelligence analyst has provided us with insights into how we can better integrate civilian expertise into our operations." Sarah had learned during her training that Agent Chen was actually a senior official with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that his involvement in her case had been part of a broader initiative to identify and recruit civilian personnel with the kind of observational skills and analytical capabilities that were crucial for modern intelligence operations. The foreign intelligence operatives involved in this case were part of a sophisticated network that had been targeting American special operations for over 2 years, Agent Chen continued. Their methods were specifically designed to exploit the trust relationships and communication patterns that make our special operations so effective. Ms. Martinez's background and perspective allowed her to notice inconsistencies that might have been overlooked by personnel who were more familiar with military protocols. Thompson, who was attending the briefing via secure video link from his current assignment, appeared on the screen at the front of the room. His face showed the confidence and focus of someone whose career had recovered and thrived following the difficult events of 6 months ago. Sarah, Thompson said, addressing her directly through the video connection, I wanted to personally thank you again for the decision you made that day. Your willingness to trust me and help complete the transmission saved more lives than we initially realized. Sarah felt a surge of pride and satisfaction at Thompson's words, but also a sense of humility about the role that chance and circumstance had played in placing her in a position where her actions could have such significant impact. Thompson, your courage in pursuing the investigation despite pressure to drop it, and your willingness to take risks to protect your fellow soldiers, exemplified the best traditions of military service, Sarah replied. I was honored to be able to help you complete that mission. Captain Martinez moved to the final section of his presentation, which outlined new protocols and training programs that had been developed based on lessons learned from the incident. Effective immediately, all civilian contractors working in support of special operations will receive enhanced security awareness training, he announced. We have also established new communication protocols for reporting security concerns, and we have expanded the role of civilian analysts in our intelligence operations. Sarah understood that her experience had helped create opportunities for other civilian personnel to contribute more directly to military operations, and she felt a responsibility to help train and mentor those who would follow in her footsteps. As the briefing concluded and personnel began to leave the room, several people approached Sarah to discuss her insights and experiences. The conversation was professional and collegial, a far cry from the isolation and invisibility she had experienced during her first 3 years at the facility. Kowalski lingered after most of the others had left, apparently wanting to speak with Sarah privately. Ma'am, I wanted you to know that your actions that day have become something of a legend among the teams, he said quietly. The story of the civilian contractor who helped expose an espionage operation has been told and retold, and it's become an example of the kind of initiative and courage that we hope to see from all personnel. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment at this revelation. I hope the story emphasizes that anyone in that situation should have made the same decision. That's exactly why it's become legendary, Kowalski replied with a smile. It shows that heroism isn't limited to people with special training or official authority. Sometimes the most important decisions are made by people who simply choose to do the right thing when it matters most. As Sarah walked back to her new office in the intelligence analysis section, she reflected on how much her understanding of herself and her capabilities had changed over the past 6 months. The woman who had once preferred invisibility was now regularly briefing senior military officers and contributing to decisions that affected national security operations. Her father had called her that morning to congratulate her on the recognition she had received in the briefing, and to tell her how proud he was of the path her career had taken. You've proven that the lessons about service and responsibility that we talked about when you were growing up weren't just abstract concepts, he had said. You've shown that ordinary people can make extraordinary contributions when they have the courage to act on their principles. Sarah's new office was located in a secure area of the building that required multiple levels of clearance to access. Her desk was equipped with computer systems that connected her to intelligence networks spanning the globe, and her daily work involved analyzing information that could affect the safety of military personnel and the security of the nation. But, despite the high-tech environment and the critical nature of her responsibilities, Sarah often thought back to that day in the equipment shed when she had made the decision to help Thompson complete his transmission. That moment had taught her that the most important choices were often the ones that had to be made with incomplete information and under pressure, and that the willingness to trust her instincts and act on her principles was the most valuable skill she could develop. As she settled down to review the intelligence reports that had arrived during the briefing, Sarah noticed a new assignment that had been placed on her desk. It was a request to provide analytical support for an operation that would require her to work directly with a team of Navy SEALs who were preparing for a mission in a region where intelligence gathering was particularly challenging. Sarah smiled as she read the assignment details, recognizing that her unique combination of civilian perspective and military experience was exactly what was needed for this type of operation. The invisible woman who had once replaced practice targets was now a crucial part of the intelligence apparatus that kept American soldiers safe and American interests secure. The legend that Kowalski had mentioned would continue to grow, told and retold throughout the special operations community as an example of how courage and good judgment could come from the most unexpected places. But, for Sarah, the real satisfaction came not from the recognition or the legend, but from the knowledge that she was using her abilities to make a meaningful contribution to something larger than herself. As she began her analysis of the new assignment, Sarah realized that the most important lesson from that day in the equipment shed wasn't about courage or heroism, but about the importance of paying attention, trusting her instincts, and being ready to act when circumstances demanded it. Those were lessons that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead, and they were lessons that any person could apply to make a difference in their own corner of the world. The range incident had become a legend, but the principles it demonstrated were available to anyone willing to embrace them. Sometimes the most powerful weapon really was the one you chose not to use, and sometimes the most important decision was the one made by someone who wasn't supposed to matter but chose to act anyway.